cheap diner napkins don't hold ink well. Red gel bled through the coarse paper, feathering at the edges of the P. Across the sticky table, the man who had just promised to ruin her life politely ordered veal. She didn't want a hero. She just wanted someone to look up. The brass grill smelled of roasted garlic, damp wool coats, and the sharp chemical undertone of industrial floor cleaner. It was the kind of mid-tier restaurant people chose when they wanted to project success, but lacked the funds to actually back it up. Dimly lit by faux brass sconces, the air was thick with the hum of forced conversation and the clatter of heavy, dull silverware against thick porcelain plates. Nadine sat in booth 4, her spine pressed so hard against the cracked red vinyl that she could feel the wooden framing underneath. Her hands rested flat on the table, flanking a glass of ice water. Condensation beaded on the glass, pooling on the varnished wood. She watched a single drop swell lose its grip and slide down to join the puddle. It was a stupid, trivial thing to focus on. But looking at the water meant she didn't have to look at Warren. Warren was meticulously breaking apart a dinner roll. He didn't tear it. He dismantled it. First in half, then into quarters, his square, manicured fingers dusting the crumbs into a neat little pile near his bread plate. "I don't think you're hearing me, Nadine," Warren said. His voice was pitched low, a smooth, reasonable baritone that barely carried over the muted jazz piped in through the ceiling speakers. He smiled, and the skin around his eyes crinkled. To anyone else in the restaurant, he looked like a husband having a mild, affectionate disagreement with his wife. "I hear you," Nadine said. Her voice felt like rusted wire in her throat. "Do you?" He picked up a butter knife. "Because if you heard me, you wouldn't be staring at that glass like it's going to grant you 3 wishes. You'd be looking at me." Nadine dragged her eyes up. Warren's face was pleasant. His tie was perfectly knotted. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and peppermint breath mints, a scent that used to mean safety, and now just triggered a cold, creeping nausea in the pit of her stomach. "I know where Maeve is," he said casually, spreading a thin layer of butter onto a piece of the roll. "She's at Mrs. Gable's house, the one on Elm Street with the peeling yellow paint. Mrs. Gable is 82. She watches television with the volume turned all the way up." Nadine's fingers dug into the edge of the table. A splinter of cheap wood bit into her thumb, but she welcomed the sharp sting. It kept her grounded. It kept her from throwing up on the table. "You leave my daughter out of this," she whispered. "Our daughter," Warren corrected gently. He took a bite of the bread, chewed slowly, and swallowed. "Legally, perhaps not. But I've provided for you both. I've paid the rent. I bought that ridiculous little car you drive. I am a fixture in her life. And you think you can just pack a duffel bag and disappear to Portland? We're done, Warren. You broke my wrist. You fell." Warren didn't blink. "You were hysterical. You tripped over the rug in the hallway, and you fell. The doctor at the ER agreed. Remember?" Nadine remembered the ER. She remembered Warren's hand resting heavily on the back of her neck as she lied to the triage nurse. She remembered the metallic tang of blood in her mouth from where she had bitten her own cheek to keep from screaming. "If you try to leave state lines," Warren continued, pouring himself a glass of the house Cabernet, "I will call child services. I have the medical records of your depressive episode last year. I have the receipts showing you can't afford groceries without my transfers. And if the courts somehow side with a mentally unstable, broke, single mother—" He paused, taking a sip of the wine. He grimaced slightly at the taste before setting the glass down. "Well, It's very easy for a child to wander off from an 82-year-old woman's front yard, Nadine. The threat wasn't a roar. It was a cold, precise surgical incision. Nadine wanted to stand up. She wanted to scream. She wanted to flip the heavy wooden table directly into his smug, unbothered face. But the logical, cynical part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive this long, calculated the variables. If she screamed, Warren would play the calm, embarrassed partner of a hysterical woman. The manager would ask them to leave. Warren had the keys to her car in his pocket. He had taken them from her purse when she went to the restroom. If she ran, he would beat her to Mrs. Gable's house. She was trapped in a public place, completely visible and utterly isolated. She needed leverage. She needed a disruption that he couldn't control. She glanced around the room, a couple arguing over a menu 2 tables down. A family of 4 wrangling a toddler near the kitchen doors. Nobody was looking at booth 4. To the world, they were just another boring dinner date. Nadine shifted her weight, dropping her left hand into her lap, letting it slide down into the open maw of her cheap faux leather tote bag resting on the bench beside her. Her fingers brushed against a crumpled receipt, a plastic hair clip, and finally, the hard cylindrical plastic of a cheap promotional gel pen she'd snagged from a bank teller months ago. She gripped it. "Are we ready to order, folks?" The voice belonged to a young waiter, probably no older than 20. His name tag read Toby. He smelled faintly of stale sweat and cheap aerosol deodorant, and his apron was stained with something that looked like marinara sauce. Toby's eyes were glassy, darting back and forth between their table and a large rowdy party on the other side of the room. He clicked a retractable ballpoint pen repeatedly, a nervous tick that set Nadine's teeth on edge. "Yes, I believe we are," Warren said, flashing Toby a warm, paternal smile. "The lady will have the grilled salmon, dressing on the side, and I'll take the veal, medium rare. If it comes out medium, I'll send it back." He said it with a chuckle, but Toby flinched anyway. "Got it. Salmon veal," Toby muttered, scribbling frantically on his pad. Nadine pulled her hand from her purse, concealing the red gel pen against her palm. With her right hand, she slid one of the rough square paper napkins from underneath her silverware. It felt coarse, like recycled cardboard. Under the lip of the table, resting on her knee, she uncapped the pen with her thumb. "Anything else to drink?" Toby asked, already pivoting his foot to leave. "Look at me," Nadine willed him. "Just look at my eyes." But Toby didn't look at her. He looked at Warren, recognizing the alpha of the table, the one who would determine the tip. Underneath the table, Nadine pressed the pen to the napkin. The ink flowed too fast, too wet. She didn't have time to write a message. She didn't have time to explain. She pressed hard, feeling the tip of the pen nearly tear through the cheap paper. H-E-L-P. She didn't look down. She couldn't risk Warren noticing the shift in her gaze. She just felt the letters, her muscle memory guiding the clumsy strokes. "Actually, could I get another glass of water?" Nadine asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Sure thing, ma'am," Toby mumbled, finally glancing her way. Nadine brought her left hand up, moving the napkin toward the edge of the table, intending to slip it into Toby's hand as he reached for her empty glass. Warren shifted. Beneath the table, his knee struck hers. It wasn't a bump. It was a sharp, localized, and incredibly painful strike directly to the nerve on the side of her leg. Nadine gasped, a short strangled sound, and her hand jerked. The napkin slipped from her fingers. It fluttered down, landing right side up on the edge of the table. partially obscured by the salt and pepper shakers. The red ink was stark against the white paper, the letters thick and jagged. Toby grabbed her glass without noticing, spun on his heel, and hurried away toward the kitchen. Nadine froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a heavy bruising rhythm. The napkin was sitting right there. If Warren turned his head 3 inches to the left, he would see it. She reached out, intending to drag it off the table and into her lap. Warren's hand shot out and clamped down on her wrist. His fingers were like a vice, pressing exactly over the spot where the bone had fractured 3 months ago. "Clumsy," he said softly, his thumb pressing into the tender hollow of her joint. "You're always so jumpy, Nadine. It's why I worry about you. It's why Maeve needs stability." He wasn't looking at the napkin. He was looking at her wrist, enjoying the wince she couldn't suppress. Across the dining room, at table 15, Harrison chewed a piece of dry-aged steak that tasted distinctly of freezer burn. Harrison was a man who hated eating alone, but hated eating with sycophants even more. He was 42, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than the waiter's yearly salary, and he was profoundly, existentially bored. He had come to this particular town to evaluate a commercial real estate portfolio, a routine acquisition that required a few days of due diligence. He had chosen the brass grill because the concierge at his hotel claimed it had character. Character, Harrison had deduced, was a polite euphemism for mediocre food and bad lighting. He took a sip of his bourbon. It was watered down. Harrison had spent his entire life studying systems, corporate hierarchies, market fluctuations, the mechanics of leverage. He didn't look at people as individuals. He looked at them as moving parts in a machine. He noticed inefficiencies. He noticed imbalances. And he had been watching Booth 4 for the last 20 minutes. He hadn't intended to. But the man with the neat hair and the forced smile was a textbook study in predatory mechanics. Harrison recognized the type. Boardrooms were full of them. Men who spoke softly but occupied maximum space. Men who dismantled rolls of bread like they were pulling wings off flies. But it was the woman who held his attention. Her posture was all wrong. She wasn't leaning in to argue. She was recoiling. Her shoulders were locked, pulled up toward her ears. Her hands were doing too much work to stay still. He had watched the exchange with the waiter. He had seen the way the man's shoulder dipped slightly, a hidden physical exertion under the table, and the way the woman had instantly gasped, her face draining of color. Harrison narrowed his eyes. The lighting was poor, but he had 20/15 vision. He saw the white square of paper sitting on the edge of their table. He saw the stark bleeding red ink. The angle was difficult, the letters partially obscured by a glass shaker, but the word was unmistakable. Help. Harrison set his bourbon down. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. He didn't feel a sudden surge of chivalry. He wasn't a hero. He was a ruthless pragmatist who had ruined a dozen companies without losing a night of sleep. But Harrison had a mother who used to wear long sleeves in the middle of July. He had a sister who would stop laughing when she married a man with a soft voice and a tight grip. He hated men who operated in the shadows. If you were going to crush someone, Harrison believed, you did it in the light, on paper, where they had a fighting chance. He wiped his mouth with his cloth napkin, dropped it onto his plate, and stood up. The floorboards creaked as Harrison crossed the room. He didn't rush. Rushing signaled panic. Rushing gave the opposition time to build a defense. He walked with the heavy, unhurried cadence of a man who owned the building. As he approached booth 4, he cataloged the details. The man, Warren, though Harrison didn't know his name, still had his hand casually draped over the woman's wrist. It looked like a gesture of intimacy until you noticed the white knuckles and the way the woman's forearm was trembling. Harrison didn't pause at the edge of their table. He didn't clear his throat. He simply stepped directly into their personal space, casting a shadow over Warren's bread plate. "Nadine," Harrison said loudly. The name was a complete guess. He had read the woman's lips a few minutes earlier when she said, "We're done," but he hadn't caught a name. He threw out Nadine, based on a split-second recollection of a file he'd read earlier that day, not caring if it was wrong. If it was wrong, he'd pivot. Nadine flinched violently, jerking her head up. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and feral. Warren's head snapped around. The pleasant mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of sheer, unadulterated irritation before slamming back into place. His hand released Nadine's wrist, sliding back to his own side of the table, like a snake retreating into the grass. "Excuse me?" Warren said, his tone perfectly polite, perfectly cold. "Do we know you?" "I don't know you," Harrison said, ignoring Warren entirely and keeping his eyes fixed on the woman. She looked terrified, but beneath the terror, he saw the gears turning. She was smart. She realized he was throwing her a lifeline. "Nadine, for Christ's sake, it is you," Harrison lied effortlessly, letting a wide, familiar grin stretch across his face. He leaned in, placing his hands flat on the edge of their table, dominating the physical space. "I thought I recognized you from across the room. It's been what, 3 years? Since the Chicago conference?" Nadine stared at him. She smelled expensive cologne, bergamot and cedar, and saw a man whose suit jacket draped perfectly over a broad frame. His eyes were dark, sharp, and totally devoid of warmth, but they were locked onto hers with a silent, intense command. "Play along." "Yes," Nadine croaked. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking. "Chicago. Yes, it's been a long time." "Too long," Harrison said. Without asking permission, he reached over, grabbed a heavy wooden chair from the adjacent empty table, and dragged it over. The legs scraped harshly against the floorboards, a loud, ugly sound that made a few heads turn. He dropped into the chair, effectively blocking Warren's exit from the booth. "I'm sorry, friend," Warren said, the baritone dropping an octave, the smile tightening into a grimace. "We're actually in the middle of a rather private dinner. Are you?" Harrison didn't look at Warren. He reached across the table, his hand sweeping carelessly over the salt shaker. His fingers brushed the rough paper napkin. In one fluid motion, he crumpled it into his palm and pocketed it. "That's a shame, because I'm in town for one night and I absolutely have to steal her for 10 minutes. Corporate mandates." Warren's jaw clenched. The muscles ticked under his skin. "She doesn't work in corporate anymore." "I know," Harrison said smoothly, finally turning to look Warren dead in the eye. "She works for me now. Independent consultancy. Highly lucrative. And currently she's late for a debriefing." The lie was absurd, full of holes, and delivered with the absolute crushing confidence of a man used to bending reality to his will. Warren leaned forward, dropping the polite facade. His voice was a venomous whisper meant only for their table. "Listen to me, you arrogant prick. I don't know who you are, or what kind of game you're playing, but she is my wife, and she is staying right here." "I'm not your wife, Warren," Nadine said. The words bypassed her brain. They just fell out of her mouth, fueled by the sudden, massive shift in gravity the stranger had brought to the table. She pulled her arms back, crossing them tightly over her chest. Harrison raised an eyebrow at Warren. Sounds like a dispute for a courtroom, not a steakhouse. Now I suggest you enjoy the veal. I hear the chef microwaves it to perfection." Harrison stood up. He looked down at Nadine. "Grab your bag." Warren's hand shot across the table, grabbing the strap of Nadine's tote bag before she could lift it. "She's not going anywhere. I have her car keys." "Keep them," Harrison said. He didn't raise his voice, but the sudden icy stillness in his posture made Warren freeze. Harrison leaned down, bringing his face inches from Warren's. The smell of sandalwood and mint met the smell of bourbon and wealth. "I don't care about the keys," Harrison murmured, his voice so quiet it barely registered above the restaurant hum. "I don't care about the car. What I care about is that you let go of that bag right now. Or I am going to buy this restaurant, fire the staff, lock the doors, and spend the rest of the evening making sure you learn how to chew your food through a wire. Do you understand the mathematics of what I am telling you? It wasn't a physical threat. It was a promise of total systemic annihilation." Warren looked into Harrison's eyes and saw no hesitation. He saw a predator infinitely higher on the food chain. Slowly, Warren uncurled his fingers from the faux leather strap. "Good choice," Harrison said. He stepped back, gesturing for Nadine to slide out of the booth. Nadine scrambled. Her knees hit the underside of the table, rattling the water glasses, but she didn't care. She clutched her bag to her chest, slipping out of the vinyl trap and stepping into the aisle. Her legs felt like water, shivering violently. "We'll be in touch, Warren," Harrison said loudly, clapping his hands together. "Enjoy the bread." He placed a hand lightly on the small of Nadine's back. Not a push, but a barrier between her and the booth. "Walk," he said quietly. "Don't look back." Nadine walked. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the brass grill, the cold night air slamming into her face, smelling of car exhaust and impending rain. It was the best thing she had ever breathed. The sidewalk outside was a shock of cold, wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jaundiced shadows across the pavement. Nadine's lungs burned as she pulled in the damp air. She stopped near a rusted parking meter, bracing her good hand against the metal pole. Her knees were shaking so violently she thought her legs might simply buckle and leave her kneeling in the grime. Harrison didn't stop. He walked 3 paces ahead, his leather Oxfords clicking rhythmically against the concrete, before he realized that she wasn't beside him. He turned, the collar of his expensive coat turned up against the wind. "Breathe," Harrison said. It wasn't a comforting suggestion. It was a command. Hyperventilating on a public street is bad strategy. It draws attention. We want to be ghosts right now. "My daughter," Nadine choked out. The words felt like ground glass in her throat. "He knows where she is. He has my car. He's going to go to Mrs. Gable's house." "He isn't going anywhere for at least 10 minutes, Harrison said, checking a heavy silver watch on his left wrist. "Men like that don't run out on the bill. It violates their sense of social order. He's currently sitting at that table, calculating his exposure, deciding if I'm an actual threat or just a bluff. Then he has to wait for the waiter, pay, and walk to the lot. We have a window, but it's closing. Where is the house? Elm Street, 3 miles from here." Nadine pushed off the meter, her chest heaving. "I have to get there. I don't have my car. I need to run." "You aren't running 3 miles in the rain," Harrison replied flatly. He pressed a button on a sleek black key fob. Half a block down, the headlights of a massive charcoal gray sedan flashed twice. It was a German import, heavy and low to the ground, looking less like a car and more like a piece of military hardware dressed in a bespoke suit. "Get in." Nadine hesitated. The adrenaline that had propelled her out of the booth was beginning to curdle into a cold, sharp paranoia. She had just escaped a monster she knew by relying on a stranger she didn't. Harrison was imposing, clinical, and completely unreadable. She hugged her cheap faux leather tote tight against her ribs. "I don't know you," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You could be worse." Harrison let out a short, dry exhale that might have been a laugh if it held any humor. "I assure you, Nadine, I am entirely too busy to be worse. I evaluate commercial real estate acquisitions. Tomorrow morning at 8, I have a hostile takeover meeting regarding a logistics firm that employs 2,000 people. You and your domestic dispute are a rounding error in my schedule. I intervened because I despise bullies who hide in diners. Now, you can stand out here and wait for him, or you can get in the car and we go get your kid. The mathematics are very simple." He didn't wait for her answer. He turned and walked toward the sedan, unlocking it and sliding into the driver's seat. Nadine looked back at the heavy wooden doors of the brass grille. The glass was opaque with condensation, but she imagined she could see Warren's shadow moving toward the exit. The nausea hit her again. She swallowed hard, turned, and practically sprinted to the passenger side of the sedan. She yanked the heavy door open and threw herself inside. The interior smelled of immaculate leather, ozone, and faint bergamot. It was dead quiet, the thick glass cutting off the noise of the street entirely. "Buckle up," Harrison said, shifting the car into gear. The engine didn't roar. It purred, a deep, vibrationless thrum of engineered power. Nadine fumbled with the seatbelt with her left hand. Her right wrist was throbbing, a dull, sickening ache that radiated up to her elbow. Warren's grip had re-bruised the healing bone. She managed to click the metal tongue into place, just as Harrison pulled smoothly away from the curb. "Left at the next light," she instructed, her voice shaky. Then straight for 2 miles. Harrison merged into the sparse traffic. The wipers swept silently across the windshield, clearing the gathering drizzle. He drove exactly the speed limit, his hands at 10 and 2, his profile illuminated by the stark clinical glow of the dashboard. He didn't ask her about the napkin. He didn't ask her about Warren. He didn't demand the backstory. "Why did you keep the napkin?" Nadine asked suddenly, staring at the side of his face. "Leverage," Harrison replied, not taking his eyes off the road. "Physical evidence of coercion in a public setting. Men like your friend back there operate on deniability. He hurts you where no one can see, and he uses your fear to maintain control. If he ever tries to spin a narrative that you were the unstable aggressor, a piece of paper with a distress signal written during a dinner date is a compelling counter-narrative." "It's just a napkin," she whispered, looking down at her battered tote bag. "Nobody would care." "Lawyers care about documentation," Harrison corrected. "And you are going to need a very good lawyer." "I don't have any money," Nadine said, the bitter reality settling over her like a heavy, wet blanket. "He drained the joint account. He put the lease in his name. That's why I was trying to leave. I had $300 saved in a coffee can, and he found it." Harrison didn't respond immediately. He hit the turn signal, the rhythmic clicking filling the quiet cabin. He took the corner perfectly, the heavy car absorbing the uneven pavement without a shudder. "Money is just a tool," he said finally. "The problem isn't that you don't have money. The problem is that you let him convince you that you have no value without it. You survived an abusive environment, managed to secure your child at a safe secondary location, and devised an improvised signaling system in a highly surveilled environment. You're resourceful. Resourceful people don't stay broke." Nadine stared at the windshield. It was the strangest pep talk she had ever received. It lacked entirely the warmth of empathy. It was an assessment. He was looking at her the way he probably looked at a bankrupt company, finding the salvageable assets amidst the wreckage. "Turn right here," she said, pointing to a dark, tree-lined street. Elm Street. "It's the fourth house on the left, the yellow one." Harrison killed the headlights before they reached the driveway, coasting the heavy sedan to a silent stop against the curb. The house was small, the paint peeling in long, sad strips. The porch light was off. The only illumination came from the bluish flicker of a television through the living room window. Nadine unbuckled her seatbelt. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. She scanned the street. There were a few parked cars, but none of them belonged to Warren. They had beaten him here. "Leave your bag," Harrison instructed. "Move fast. Don't knock. If the old woman is deaf, you'll just waste time trying to explain it to her. If you have a key, use it. Get the child, get whatever coats are near the door, and get back in. We have maybe 4 minutes before he figures out you didn't run on foot." Nadine didn't argue. She pushed the heavy car door open and stepped out into the rain. The wet grass soaked through her cheap canvas shoes instantly. She sprinted up the cracked concrete walkway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached the wooden porch, the boards groaning under her weight. She dug into her coat pocket, her trembling fingers searching for the spare brass key she had copied 3 weeks ago. She found it, shoving it into the deadbolt. The lock was old and sticky. She forced it, ignoring the sharp pain shooting up her right arm, and twisted. It clicked. She pushed the door open. The house smelled of stale floral perfume, dust, and boiled vegetables. The television was blaring a late-night infomercial, the volume painfully high. Mrs. Gable was asleep in a floral armchair, her head tilted back, a thin stream of saliva pooling at the corner of her mouth. Nadine moved past her, silent on the worn carpet. She pushed open the door to the small guest room at the back of the house. Maeve was asleep on the narrow twin bed. She was 4 years old, curled into a tight ball, her thumb resting near her mouth. She wore her faded pink pajamas, with the little cartoon dogs on them. Nadine felt a sob claw its way up her throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't fall apart. Not yet. She reached down, wrapping her left arm under Maeve's knees and her right arm, ignoring the searing agony in her wrist, behind her daughter's back. She lifted. Maeve felt incredibly heavy, a dead weight of sleep and innocence. The little girl murmured, her face pressing into Nadine's neck. "Shh, baby." "Mommy's here," Nadine whispered, burying her face in Maeve's sleep-tousled hair. She smelled of baby shampoo and warm skin. "We're going on a trip." Nadine grabbed Maeve's small winter coat off the chair and hurried back through the living room. Mrs. Gable didn't stir. Nadine stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind her. The lock clicked into place. The rain had picked up, cold and biting. She hurried down the walkway, shielding Maeve's face from the wind. As she reached the curb, a pair of headlights swept down Elm Street, turning the corner entirely too fast. The beams cut through the darkness, sweeping over the wet pavement, illuminating the peeling yellow house. Nadine froze. The approaching car was a silver SUV. Warren's car. Her car. "Get in," Harrison barked, leaning across the center console and shoving the passenger door open from the inside. Nadine lunged. She practically threw herself into the sedan, shielding Maeve with her body as she collapsed into the leather seat. She grabbed the heavy door handle and pulled it shut with a solid, echoing thud. "Down!" Harrison ordered, his voice devoid of panic but sharp with authority. Keep her below the window line. Nadine slid off the leather seat, wedging herself into the footwell, curling her body tightly around her sleeping daughter. Maeve whined, a soft sound of protest, and Nadine pressed a trembling hand against the back of the little girl's head, holding her close to her chest. The floor mats smelled of harsh rubber and chemicals. Outside, the silver SUV slowed to a crawl. The headlights washed over the interior of the German sedan, casting harsh shadows against the roof. Nadine held her breath. Her ribs ached from the tension. She listened to the heavy tires of Warren's car sloshing through the wet puddles, the engine idling low and menacing. In the driver's seat, Harrison sat perfectly still. He didn't duck. He didn't avert his eyes. He leaned back against the headrest, staring blankly ahead into the rain, projecting the aura of a man who was simply waiting for his wife to run into a friend's house. The tint on the sedan's windows was heavy, but not impenetrable. If Warren looked closely, he would see a man in a suit. He would not see the woman folded into a panic-stricken ball on the floorboards. The silver SUV stopped directly parallel to them. Nadine squeezed her eyes shut. She waited for the sound of a car door opening. She waited for the heavy, confident footsteps on the pavement. She waited for Warren to tap on the glass, for the polite, terrifying mask to slip away entirely. Her right wrist throbbed in time with her racing pulse. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then, the SUV's engine revved. The tires spun slightly on the wet asphalt, gripping late, and the car accelerated away, heading further down Elm Street, brake lights flaring red as it turned the next corner. He was looking for a woman walking on foot. He wasn't looking for a corporate executive in a $100,000 car. Nadine let out a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. Her lungs burned. She didn't move from the floorboards until she felt the sedan shift into drive and heard the low hum of the engine pulling them away from the curb in the opposite direction. "He's gone," Harrison said, his voice flat. He didn't turn on the headlights until they were 3 blocks away. Nadine clumsily pulled herself back up onto the seat, bringing Maeve with her. The little girl finally opened her eyes, blinking against the dim dashboard lights. She looked at Harrison, then up at her mother. "Mommy," Maeve mumbled, rubbing her eye with a small, pale fist. "Where are we?" "We're going on a ride, sweetie," Nadine whispered, kissing the top of her head. Her voice cracked, a ragged, ugly sound. "Go back to sleep." Maeve, used to the chaotic, shifting realities of her mother's anxiety, simply nodded and laid her head on Nadine's chest. Her eyes drifting shut again. Harrison drove in silence for 20 minutes, navigating the city's labyrinth of rain-slicked highways until they reached a brightly lit, sterile chain motel on the outskirts of the industrial district. It was exactly the kind of place that demanded cash and asked 0 questions. He pulled the sedan under the bright, fluorescent canopy of the lobby entrance and parked. He put the car in park and left the engine running. The heater blew dry, hot air over Nadine's freezing legs. "I have a meeting at 8, Harrison said, finally looking at her. The clinical detachment was back in his eyes. The adrenaline of the extraction had faded, replaced by the tedious reality of logistics. Nadine shifted Maeve's weight. "I know. You've done more than enough. I don't know how to thank you. I can't pay you back." Harrison reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, minimalist leather wallet. He extracted a thick fold of $100 bills, at least $2,000, and a crisp, matte black business card. He set them both on the center console, pushing them slightly toward her. I don't do charity, Nadine, Harrison said smoothly. Charity creates dependence. I deal in investments. Consider this seed capital. Use the cash to get a room, buy prepaid phones, and get out of the state by morning. Do not use your credit cards. Do not contact your friends. Men like Warren track digital footprints better than bloodhounds. Nadine stared at the money. It was more cash than she had seen in a year. It looked dirty, dangerous, and incredibly beautiful. What's the card for? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. That is the personal cell phone number of a woman named Evelyn Vance in Chicago. She was a corporate litigator before she got bored and started crushing abusive ex-husbands for sport, Harrison replied. He tapped the stiff card with his index finger. When you are safe, you call her. You tell her Harrison sent you. You tell her you have physical evidence of assault, a documented pattern of financial abuse, and you want full custody. She will take the case pro bono because she owes me a favor and because she hates men who dismantle bread rolls like sociopaths. Nadine reached out with her left hand, picking up the stack of bills and the black card. The edges of the paper cut into her cold fingers. She looked at Harrison. He wasn't smiling. There was no warmth in his gaze, no paternal comfort. He was exactly what he claimed to be, a pragmatic, ruthless man who simply preferred a balanced equation. Why? Nadine asked, the raw vulnerability bleeding through her cynical armor. You could have just kept walking. I could have, Harrison agreed, adjusting his grip on the leather steering wheel. He looked out through the rain-streaked windshield toward the neon sign of the motel. But the world is already entirely too full of men who leverage power to trap people in corners. I find it aesthetically displeasing, and occasionally I like to remind them that there is always a bigger fish. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers one last time. Don't waste the investment, Nadine. Nadine tightened her grip on her daughter. The pain in her right wrist was a sharp, grounding reminder of the life she was leaving behind in that diner booth. She opened the heavy door, the cold night air rushing in to meet her. I won't, she said. She stepped out into the rain, the heavy door thudding shut behind her. The sleek charcoal sedan didn't linger. The brake lights flared briefly, and then it glided away into the dark, leaving her standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, holding her daughter, holding the money, and for the first time in 3 years, holding her own future. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to let the algorithm know. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another intense, grounded drama. What would you have done if you saw that napkin? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Share this video with someone who loves a story about fighting back, and I'll see you in the next one.